On July 11, 1985, the crowd inside the casino ballroom at Trump's Hotel in Atlantic City had no idea they were watching the early stages of something extraordinary. A 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn was walking into the ring for only the fifth professional fight of his career. His name was Mike Tyson. At that point, Tyson wasn't yet the heavyweight champion everyone would eventually know. He was still an unknown teenager outside serious boxing circles. But inside the ring, he was already leaving a trail of destruction. His first 4 professional opponents had all been stopped before the 3rd round. And now another undefeated fighter stood in front of him, waiting to find out whether Tyson's reputation was real. There was one man who already had no doubts. Cus D'Amato. The veteran trainer had spent years shaping Tyson, and he believed this teenager was capable of becoming the youngest heavyweight champion in history. But Cus didn't stop there. He believed that if Tyson stayed committed, avoided distractions, and continued developing, he could eventually be remembered as one of the greatest heavyweight champions the sport had ever produced. Those were enormous expectations for a 19-year-old. Yet Cus wasn't simply making bold predictions. He had seen what Tyson was becoming. He had drilled the fundamentals into him over and over again, building a fighter whose movements were designed for one purpose: getting inside an opponent's defenses and destroying him at close range. At the center of that system was the peekaboo style. Tyson kept his stance low, his hands high, and his chin protected behind his gloves. His head was constantly moving, slipping from side to side as he advanced. For a taller opponent, that movement created a nightmare. The closer Tyson got, the less comfortable his opponent became. And once Tyson entered that range, the punches came from everywhere: short hooks, uppercuts, combinations thrown from angles that were extremely difficult to anticipate. It wasn't just about power. It was about positioning. It was about timing. And it was about forcing an opponent into the exact distance where Tyson was most dangerous. That system had been built around Tyson's natural abilities, but Cus understood something else. A trainer can teach the same techniques to different fighters, yet each fighter will ultimately express them in his own way. Tyson's way was already becoming unmistakable. He was explosive, aggressive, and unusually composed for someone so young. And he wasn't simply relying on what happened inside the ring. Tyson was studying boxing constantly. He read about the sport. He watched old fights. He studied the great heavyweights, learning from their movements and trying to understand what made them successful. His manager Jimmy Jacobs also had an enormous collection of fight films, giving Tyson access to generations of boxing knowledge. So while the public saw a teenager knocking opponents out, Tyson was quietly building an understanding of the sport far beyond his experience. But that night in Atlantic City, he still had to prove himself against a man who wasn't interested in becoming another quick victim. John Alderson was 28 years old and came from West Virginia. He entered the fight with a perfect 4-0 professional record. Every one of those victories had come by knockout. And outside the ring, Alderson had a completely different life from the teenager standing across from him. He worked as a coal miner. Every day, he went underground and did physically demanding work that required a different kind of toughness. He had also stepped away from boxing for several years before returning to the sport. Now he had rebuilt himself into an undefeated professional, and this fight represented perhaps his biggest opportunity yet. Alderson had the size advantage. He had experience. He had his own knockout power. And if Tyson rushed recklessly forward, Alderson had the reach to make him pay. But from the opening bell, Tyson made it clear that this wasn't going to be a comfortable fight for the bigger man. Rather than staying at the end of Alderson's punches, Tyson immediately began working his way inside. His head movement allowed him to slip past the jab, while his compact punches began finding their target. Alderson's nose was damaged early, and suddenly his attempts to control the distance became even more difficult. Every time he tried to establish his range, Tyson found another way forward. And there was something particularly unsettling about the way Tyson operated. He looked completely comfortable. At one point, he even briefly changed stances before returning to his natural position, almost as if he was experimenting with what Alderson could handle. The punches weren't wild. They were short and precise. Tyson was finding openings and taking them without wasting much energy. Alderson tried to answer with his long right hand, hoping to catch Tyson as he came forward. But Tyson's head movement was making the target difficult to find. He would slip underneath the punch, change the angle, and suddenly be standing in front of Alderson again. That was exactly what Cus had trained him to do. Don't fight from a distance where the opponent is comfortable. Get inside. Make the bigger fighter uncomfortable. And then attack. By the closing moments of the first round, Alderson was already showing the effects of Tyson's pressure. But Tyson's corner wanted something more. They told him to go to the body. And Tyson listened. Instead of chasing only the head, he began mixing punches downstairs with his attacks upstairs. That adjustment mattered. The body work forced Alderson to protect himself in another area, while Tyson continued finding opportunities around his guard. The damage started accumulating quickly. A cut opened above Alderson's left eye. His vision was becoming a problem. His ability to create distance was fading. And Tyson was still moving forward. Alderson had entered the ring undefeated, but now he was fighting simply to survive. Tyson had already dropped him once. Then again. Each time Alderson managed to get back up, but the situation wasn't changing. Tyson had found his range. He had found the weaknesses. And now he was closing the fight exactly the way Cus had taught him. The question was no longer whether Alderson could win. It was whether he could make it through another round. By the end of the second, his corner had seen enough. They stopped the contest. Mike Tyson had his 5th professional victory. 5 fights, and once again, he had barely needed to reach the later rounds. But the result only told half the story. Because after the fight, Tyson revealed something that made the performance even more interesting. When asked about the right hands Alderson had managed to throw, Tyson explained that most of them had not landed cleanly. He had been slipping them, moving at angles, and making sure the punches didn't connect with their full force. That was an important glimpse into the fighter behind the knockout record. Tyson wasn't simply overpowering opponents. He was learning how to read them. And he was doing it at just 19 years old. Still, there was one thing Tyson couldn't completely escape. The pressure. Cus D'Amato was already calling him a future heavyweight champion. People were already discussing whether he could become the youngest champion in history. And those predictions were beginning to follow Tyson into the ring. But Tyson saw himself differently. Outside boxing, he was still a 19-year-old kid. Inside the ring, however, he had a job to do. He wasn't there to think about the predictions. He was there to take care of business. And that distinction may have been one of the most important things about Tyson at this stage of his career. The legend hadn't been created yet. The championship hadn't come. The world hadn't fully discovered him. But the foundation was already there. The speed. The power. The head movement. The discipline. The intelligence. And a trainer who believed there was something much greater waiting ahead. John Alderson had entered that Atlantic City ballroom as an undefeated fighter hoping to test one of boxing's most promising young prospects. Instead, he became another victim of Tyson's rapidly growing reputation. And with 5 straight knockouts behind him, the question was becoming harder to ignore: how far could this teenager actually go? The answer to that question was still impossible to know. Tyson had only 5 professional fights behind him, and although the knockouts were coming quickly, the level of opposition would eventually have to rise. That was the real test waiting ahead. Because there was a difference between being a dangerous prospect and becoming a heavyweight champion. And Tyson's own comments after the Alderson fight showed that he understood that difference. The performance hadn't been perfect. Alderson had managed to get a few right hands through, and Tyson admitted that he wasn't completely satisfied with the way he had fought. But what mattered was how Tyson interpreted those moments. He wasn't making excuses. He was explaining them. He understood that Alderson had been looking for the right hand as Tyson entered range, and Tyson believed his movement had prevented most of those punches from landing cleanly. That awareness was becoming part of his development. He wasn't just throwing punches. He was beginning to understand why certain punches worked and why others didn't. And that was exactly the kind of education Tyson needed before stepping into the deeper waters of the heavyweight division. Because eventually, opponents were going to be faster. They were going to be stronger. They were going to be more experienced. And they were going to arrive with a plan specifically designed to deal with Mike Tyson. Alderson had tried to use his height and reach. Tyson had answered by getting underneath them. He had attacked the body, disrupted Alderson's rhythm, and forced the fight into close quarters. Once Tyson was there, the size advantage that looked so significant before the bell became much less important. That was the strength of the peekaboo system. It didn't ask Tyson to beat bigger fighters at their own game. It asked him to change the distance until they couldn't comfortably use their advantages anymore. And Tyson was learning to do that instinctively. But there was another side to the performance that had nothing to do with technique. It was the pressure surrounding him. At only 19 years old, Tyson was already being told that he could become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Cus D'Amato wasn't making those statements casually. He genuinely believed Tyson had the ability to change the sport. And that kind of belief can be powerful. It can push a fighter forward. But it can also become a burden. Every knockout makes the expectations higher. Every opponent becomes another opportunity to prove the predictions right. And suddenly, a young fighter isn't simply trying to win. He's trying to live up to a future that everyone else has already imagined for him. Tyson seemed to understand that danger. So he separated his life into two versions of himself. Outside the ring, he could still be the teenager. Inside it, there was no room for that. When the bell rang, the responsibility changed. That was where he had to take care of business. And against Alderson, he did exactly that. The fight also revealed something else about Tyson's personality. He didn't need every opponent to stand and trade with him. If someone tried to survive, Tyson would find another way to break them down. Alderson's size forced Tyson to think. His reach forced Tyson to close distance carefully. His attempts to land the right hand gave Tyson something to read. And once Tyson understood the pattern, he started making adjustments. That's what made the knockout more significant than simply another number on his record. Tyson was gaining experience without spending long periods in the ring. 5 professional fights had already taught him 5 different lessons. And because most of those fights ended so quickly, his body wasn't absorbing the kind of punishment that can slow down a young fighter's development. Instead, he was collecting victories, confidence, and experience at an extraordinary pace. But there was still a long way to go. A 19-year-old prospect could look unstoppable against one opponent and suddenly discover a completely different level of difficulty against the next. That's why Cus' prediction was both exciting and dangerous. If Tyson really was going to become the youngest heavyweight champion, he couldn't simply depend on the intimidation factor. He would have to keep improving. He would have to remain disciplined. And he would have to keep learning. Those were the exact conditions Cus had attached to his prediction from the beginning. No distractions. No loss of focus. Just development. And Tyson's early career was giving the boxing world reason to believe. The knockouts were spectacular, but the details underneath them were even more interesting. The way Tyson moved his head. The way he entered range. The way he attacked the body when the head wasn't available. The way he stayed compact while throwing combinations. And the way he recognized when an opponent was ready to break. Those weren't random instincts. They were the product of years of preparation. Cus had taken a young fighter with extraordinary physical gifts and given those gifts a structure. Now Tyson was beginning to turn that structure into something dangerous. Against John Alderson, that process produced another short night. But for Tyson, the fight was never just about how quickly he could knock someone out. Every opponent was another lesson. Every mistake was something to correct. Every successful adjustment was another step toward the fighter Cus believed he could become. And perhaps that is what made Tyson's rise so unusual. The world was looking at the knockouts. Cus was looking at the development. He wasn't asking whether Tyson could destroy the next opponent. He was thinking about whether Tyson could eventually defeat the very best heavyweights in the world. That future was still far away. The heavyweight championship was still ahead. The historic records were still ahead. The legendary nights that would eventually define Mike Tyson were still years away. But the blueprint was already visible. A teenager from Brooklyn. A trainer with an extraordinary vision. A style built around pressure, movement, and devastating combinations. And a professional record that was growing almost as quickly as the hype surrounding him. 5 fights. 5 knockouts. And still no opponent had found the answer. But boxing history has a way of asking harder questions as a fighter rises. Sooner or later, Tyson would meet someone who could withstand the first wave. Someone who wouldn't panic when he entered the pocket. Someone who could force Tyson to fight through adversity instead of simply overwhelming another opponent. That would be the real measure of Cus D'Amato's creation. Because becoming a knockout sensation was one thing. Becoming heavyweight champion was another. And becoming the greatest heavyweight champion of all time would require something far beyond power. It would require Tyson to survive the pressure that came with his own reputation. For now, though, the teenager kept moving forward. 5 opponents had stepped into the ring with Mike Tyson. 5 had failed to reach the final bell. And somewhere beneath the noise, the predictions, and the growing hype, Cus D'Amato's vision was beginning to look less like a dream and more like a destination. Mike Tyson wasn't a champion yet. He wasn't even close to the finished fighter he would eventually become. But the signs were already there. The frightening speed. The explosive power. The discipline. The intelligence. And most importantly, the hunger to keep learning. The world had only just begun to notice Mike Tyson. And if Cus was right, they were going to be hearing his name for a very, very long time.